Electroencephalography is a paradigm utilized to measure the electrical activity of the human brain. In this application, I show various electrodes commonly placed in the scalp of a human being. First, in order to detect the electrical activity of neurons in the cerebral cortex. The EEG system detects the signal created when populations of neurons are active at the same time. It typically records signals from small areas of the brain surrounding each electrode. Fundamentally, EEG measures the changes in membrane potential that are elicited by neurotransmitters, which are binding to receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. The electroencephalography provides an image of electrical activity in the brain, which is represented as a wave of varying frequencies, amplitudes, and shapes. It can be used to measure brain activity that occurs during an event. Events like performing a task or the presentation of a form of a stimulus, to measure spontaneous brain activity that happens in the absence of any specific events. In this video, I present an electroencephalography engineering prototype. I also illustrate several software algorithms used in the development for the cerebral computer interface model. One of the critical parameters in the design of the cerebral computer interface is based on the electroencephalography, that is to process and also to analyze the EEG signals in real time. The cerebral computer interface design, the EEG signal processing, aims at translating the raw EEG signals into class of these signals. The translation is achieved using a pattern recognition approach, that is, using feature extraction and classification. So, feature extraction aims at describing the EEG signal of a few relevant values called features, which is based on the Basashishti algorithm. These features captures the information embedded in the EEG signal that is relevant to describe the cerebral capacity to identify while rejecting the noise and other non-relevant information. So all features extracted are usually arranged into a vector, which is also known as a feature vector. And classification is the next step of the design methodology, which assigns a class to a set of features, that is, feature vectors, and they are extracted from the signal. This class corresponds to the kind of state identified. This step can also be denoted as feature translation, that is, classification algorithms, which are also known as classifiers. In this engineering model, the moving of an object is illustrated with motor imagery, with left or right imagery movements. To identify them from EEG signals, typical features are band power features. For example, the power of the EEG signal in a specific frequency band for MI 16 to 24 Hertz frequency bands, for electrode localized over the motor cortex areas of the brain, that is, around locations C3 and C4 for right and left movements, respectively. So, such features are then typically classified using a linear discriminant analysis classifier, also known as an L, D as in David, A. So, it is important to note and to mention that EEG signal processing is built using machine learning. This means the classifier and or the features are automatically tuned, generally for each user, according to the examples given of the EEG signal from the user interface. These EEG signals are training examples or training sets. Based on these training examples, the classifier will be tuned in order to recognize as appropriately as possible the class of the training EEG signals required. So the classification segment in a BCI aims at translating the features into commands. In order to accomplish this task, I used the regression algorithms, McFarlane algorithms, and classification algorithms. So classifiers are able to learn how to identify the class of a feature vector. This is possible via the training sets. Label feature vectors extracted from the training EEG examples. Therefore, typically, in order to learn which kind of feature vector corresponds to which class of cerebral state, classifiers try to model which area of the feature space is covered by the training feature vector from each class, is covered by the training feature vectors from each class. In this case, the classifier is a generative classifier which tries to model the boundary between the areas covered by the training feature vectors of each class, in which case the classifier is a discriminant classifier. For BCI, the most used classifier are the discriminant classifiers, and notably linear discriminant analysis (LDA) classifiers. So the aim of LDA, which is also known as Fisher's LDA, is to use hyperplanes to separate the training feature vectors representing the different classes. The location and orientation of this hyperplane is determined from the training data. Basic design methodology. Oscillatory activity-based BCI are based on change in power in some frequency bands in some specific cerebral areas, such as where they naturally need to exploit both the spatial and spectral information. So here is an example, a basic design for motor imagery. BCI would exploit the spatial information by extracting features from the EEG channels localized over the motorized areas within the cerebral segment. Channel C3 for right movements, CZ for foot movements, and C4 for left hand movements. This exploits the spectral information by focusing on frequency bands of mu 8 to 12 Hz and beta 16 to 24 Hz. To be precise, for a BCI that can recognize left hand movement MI versus right hand movement MI, the basic feature extracted would be the average band power in 8 to 12 Hz and 16 to 24 Hz from both channels C3 and C4. So the EEG signals will be described and emphasized in only 4 features. So you can compute the band power features from EEG signals by using the efficient first band pass filter, such as shown in this video application. The EEG signal from a given channel into the frequency band of interest, then to square the resulting signal, to compute the signal power, and finally the average over time. This is illustrated in this video as presented in this project. I also use the classical algorithms in machine learning, such as Guyon and Elisef. Also is very popular in BCI design methodology. Here I use univariate algorithms, which evaluate the discriminative or descriptive power of each feature individually. Then they select the n best individual features. N needs to be defined by the BCI. So the usefulness of each feature is typically assessed using measures such as t-statistics, which measures the feature value difference between two classes. and correlation-based measures such as R-square of mutual information, which measures the dependence between the feature value and the class label. Using multivariate algorithms to evaluate subsets and keep the best subject with n features. This algorithm typically uses measure of global performance for the subsets of features, such as measurements of classification performances on the training set of software algorithms, which typically use cross-validation. One of them is Brownie, or multivariate mutual information measures. Keep in mind that multivariate methods rely on heuristics in order to reduce the number of subsets to evaluate. Also using feature selection or dimensionality reduction algorithm, which is applied in this specific model. The second category of spatial filters, such as data-driven spatial filters, are optimized for each subject according to training data. As in any data-driven algorithm, the spatial filter weights, WI, can be estimated in an unsupervised way, that is, without the knowledge of which training data belongs to which class, or in a supervised way, with each training data being labeled with its class. The Cerebral computer interface system design methodology consists of 5 stages: the signal acquisition, pre-processing, feature extraction, and I will make emphasis on this part of the 5 stages: feature extraction, classification, control interface. So I will present the feature extraction methodology in this segment, and also with respect to convolutional neural networks. In this design, I talk about 2 types of feature extraction, which forms part of the methodology. Both methods transform the time domain EEG data into frequency domain. The first method transforms the EEG data into magnitude spectrum representations, and the next method involves transforming the EEG signal into the complex spectrum representation. Both methods are used in feature extraction as it relates to EEG data before being fed as input to the convolutional neural network for classification. Within the magnitude spectrum features, in this methodology, the preprocessed time domain EEG segment x of n were transformed into a frequency domain x of k, computed by the first Fourier transform, that is the FFT. This resulted in a sequence of complex numbers represented in the equation from which the magnitude spectrum was calculated. The frequency resolution of the FFT was fixed as 0.2930 Hz, and the frequency components between 3 Hz and 35 Hz. I had selected these figures. As a result, the length of the first Fourier transform, that is the FFT transformed signal, was n f of c equals to 110. The resultant feature vector computed along each channel were stacked together to form a matrix with several dimensions. The complex spectrum, that is the complex FFT, was used to derive both magnitude and phase-related information of the signal. First, the input time domain signal was transformed into the complex FFT representation using the standard fast Fourier transform with a resolution of 0.2930 Hz. Next, the frequency components of the real part and the imaginary part along each channel were extracted between 3 Hz and 35 Hz, resulting in 2 vectors of length 110 each. These 2 vectors were concatenated into a single feature vector as I equals RE of X and limit X, where the first half contained the real part and the second half contained the imaginary part of the complex fast Fourier transform, resulting in a vector length of 220. The CNN network learning and the training parameters, that is, the weights of the CNN, were initialized based on a Gaussian distribution. The network was trained using a backpropagation technique by minimizing the categorical cross entropy loss L with its presented equations.
The neural network algorithm corresponds to a function which, given a weight, maps an input to an output. The optimization takes as an input a sequence of training examples and produces a sequence of weights